From New York City, I'm Stephen Shalowitz, and this is the One Way Ticket Show.
So this man who I mentioned earlier, the Grand Mufti, Haj Amin al-Husseini, he had actually been appointed to his post by the British, despite the fact that he had already incited a deadly riot in 1920 that killed, I think it was 5 Jews in Jerusalem, but injured dozens of others. And the British put out a warrant for his arrest, but he fled Palestine, going into hiding in Jordan and Syria. And then when the British put in place their first High Commissioner of Palestine, so the most important British official in Palestine was the High Commissioner. His name was Herbert Samuel. He was actually Jewish and a Zionist, but he pardoned everyone that had been arrested after those riots in 1920. And then when Haj Amin al-Husseini's older brother, who had been the Grand Mufti, when he passed away and there was an election to replace him, despite the fact that he had incited these riots, despite the fact that he was a virulent anti-Semite, Herbert Samuel appointed him to take that position, despite the fact that he had come in last in this election. But due to Ottoman rules that the British kept in place, the British were allowed to pick their choice of the candidates who had run, even though he hadn't won the election.
We're going to get back to Hebron in just a sec, but talk about Haj Amin al-Husseini post the massacre and especially during World War II.
Yeah, so after the massacre, the British brought this commission from London to determine the causes of the riots, and that commission produced hundreds of pages of hearings and report, and I read all of this for the book, and it's very clear from these testimonies and these hearings what led to this 1929 massacre, and it was this incitement campaign. And yet, despite that, the conclusions of this commission pardoned the Grand Mufti, allowed him to keep his position that the British had appointed him to, and instead blamed the Jews of Palestine. And the fact that he had incited these riots against the Jews and was allowed to keep his position made him all the more powerful and all the more popular within Palestinian society. And he started to intimidate, harass, and even kill dissidents and critics. He became so sure of himself in terms of his place at the top of Palestinian society that when a grassroots rebellion against British rule began in 1936, he co-opted it. And so the Great Arab Revolt of 1936, he essentially oversaw it and continued his campaign of, killing off anyone who tried to challenge his role. The rebellion that he oversaw against British rule that began in 1936, it wasn't just against British rule. It was also against the immigration of masses of Jewish refugees from Eastern Europe, where pogroms were raging. And that rebellion killed hundreds of Jews, and the British still allowed the Grand Mufti to keep his position. But when that rebellion claimed the life of a British official, finally the British decided that they had enough of the Grand Mufti and they wanted to strip him of his title. They decided to arrest him, but once again he fled, and this time he ended up in Berlin, where he lived from 1941 to 1945 in a Nazi-financed estate that had been confiscated from its Jewish owners. And he met with Hitler soon after he arrived in Berlin and pledged his allegiance and the allegiance of his people to the Nazi cause. He vowed not only to help the Nazis from his base in Berlin, but vowed to help them bring their solution to other parts of the world, including the Middle East, and asked for Hitler's help in preventing the establishment of a Jewish home in Palestine. And so from 1941 to 1945, he followed through on that vow. And he was the head of the Arab Bureau of the Nazis' Ministry of Propaganda. He delivered Nazi propaganda throughout the Arab world. He helped to recruit tens of thousands of Muslims to fight for the Nazi cause. He recruited them to the SS from Bosnia and Herzegovina. And when the war ended, he was placed on the UN's list of Nazi war criminals. So the first leader of the Palestinian people was wanted for Nazi war crimes. And that was actually one of the most shocking revelations of my research for this book, because I had never known that. I had heard of the Grand Mufti. I had actually seen the picture of him meeting with Hitler in 1941, but I didn't know what came of that meeting or what led to that meeting. And so it was quite a shock to discover that really dark history and that chapter of Holocaust history, because I think so much of what we learn about the Holocaust is what took place in Europe, but the fusion of Islamic anti-Semitism with Nazi anti-Semitism that I learned through this research didn't end with the Grand Mufti. It was, it was evident with other Arab leaders as well and carried through after the Holocaust.
And he was one of those that incited the Farhud
Right.
in Iraq. So do share that.
So when he fled Palestine, he actually ended up first, before he went to Berlin, he first spent some time in Iraq. And he was there during the Farhud, this horrific massacre of the Iraqi Jewish population. So Baghdad in 1941, before the Farhud, before this massacre, was about 40% Jewish. There were 100,000 Jews living in Baghdad at that time. Iraq had had a beautiful, thriving, long-time Jewish population. And today, most of those Jews and their descendants live in Israel, and that is largely because of the Farhud. And the Farhud was yet again a result of disinformation and religious incitement against.
It was a horrible, horrible pogrom. Again, killings, rapes, murders among the Iraqi Jewish community by their Arab neighbors.
Exactly.
Right, that's what it was. He was also implicit in deaths of Jews, though, in Europe, though, wasn't he?
Right. So he, outside of his work with the Nazis, and should mention he became very close with other Nazis, not just Hitler, but Himmler and the Grand Mufti exchanged many letters praising one another and promising victory for their causes. And he, outside of his work with the Nazis, actually personally lobbied, sent letters to various leaders throughout Europe, pleading with them not to allow their Jewish refugees to flee to Palestine, to the land of Israel, to their ancient homeland, which was at that time under the rule of the British. And the British, we shouldn't let them get off the hook here either.
Yeah, they don't get a free pass by any means.
No, I mean, not only did they elevate this man who was completely unqualified for his role, I should have mentioned earlier, he didn't have the religious qualifications to be the leading Islamic official of Palestine. All of the people he ran against were more qualified. He never finished his Islamic education. And so he lobbied these leaders to prevent the Jews who were fleeing their countries, fleeing Nazi persecution. He said, don't let them come to Palestine, send them to Poland. This was in 1943 when he knew exactly what was happening to Jews in Poland. And the British as well at this time had severe quotas on Jewish immigration. So those quotas allowed just a few thousand Jews to come in each year, a few thousand each year during and before the Holocaust.
Yeah, the numbers were capped.
And yet Jews were fleeing for their lives. This was in the 1930s up until the Holocaust. And during the Holocaust, the British were not just sending Jews back to Europe, where they knew what would happen to them, but they were also holding them in camps, in internment camps in Cyprus and in Palestine. And up until 1948, the day when the British left Palestine and Israel declared independence, there were 50,000 Jews still held in these camps, and they were finally able to enter the land of Israel.
Yeah, it's just absolutely extraordinary. It's a part of history, as you say, most people don't know about. And so many people don't know the real story behind Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. And that's why I wanted you to share that. And it's really such a important thread throughout the book, and indeed a historical thread that resonates today.